Hello, in this video we're going to see Metafields. Metafields allow us to add extra information to resources such as products or pages that is not normally captured in Shopify by default. Metafields can be created with the purpose of displaying the information stored down in your store's frontend, but they can also be created for internal usage. That is, their content won't be directly displayed to the customer, but the data stored in them could be used for filtering certain items, custom reports, working with automations, and much more. Here, Shopify gives us a few examples of common metafields, such as part numbers, launch dates, files for download, or list of ingredients. It wouldn't make sense for Shopify to add all of these fields to the whole platform because not every single store will really need to have list of ingredients. For example, if you have a furniture store, you don't need to have a field for list of ingredients. So this is why Shopify, instead of adding this field to the platform, gave us the ability to create it ourselves when we need it. Now, which resources can be the owner of a Metafield? Well, there are plenty of resources that can do that, and the comprehensive list can be found in the Metafield owner type enum for the GraphQL API. We are not going to be using this API in this video, but just be aware that everything mentioned here supports Metafields. I'm going to be linking this in the video description so you can use it as a reference if you need to. In the most common instances, however, such as with product, page, order, product variant, and so on, you will be able to add this directly or to create metafields for this directly from the Shopify admin. But for a few other instances, such as shop, for example, you won't be able to create shop metafields directly from the Shopify admin. You will need to either query this API or find a third-party app that does that. We will cover more of that in a future video. Now let's see how to add a metafield from Shopify admin. So from the admin panel of my store, I'm going to go to settings, and here I'll click on custom data. If you have this menu grayed out, you will need to ask the owner of the store to give you permission to access it. And here we see a list of all the resource types that support being the owner of a metafield when we create a metafield through the admin. You'll notice that this list is shorter than the one we saw a moment ago, but this should do for the most basic or essential use cases. So here, let's create a metafield for product. We can see here a list of already created metafields that came in by default when I created this store because I selected the populate with test data option. You may have this empty or with other metafields that were added by someone else, but the important part here is to click on add definition, and we have to fill this form to create a metafield. Starting at the top, we have the name field. This is how this metafield will be identified internally in the Shopify admin. So only you and the people who have access to the Shopify admin should be able to see what you type here. Therefore, it will not appear in the front end. I'm going to type here example metafield. And we have some suggested standard definitions, but for now, I'm just going to click here on example metafield right at the top. This will create also the namespace and key combination. Shopify by default sets the namespace to be custom, and then the key will be some version of what you just typed in name. For example, it turned everything into lowercase and it added an underscore instead of spaces. This is a namespace and key combination because third-party apps can also add metafields. So in the rare instance that a third-party app adds a metafield with a key and you also try to add a metafield by yourself with a key, there will be a collision if the key are both the same. To avoid that, we have namespaces, so that way each third-party app can namespace their metafields to a unique namespace for them, and you can namespace the metafields you add to something unique for yourself. By default, Shopify sets the namespace to be custom, but you can change it to something else if you want to, like this. Also, I suggest you leave custom on this, unless you have a good reason not to do so. Next, we have the description field. This is more like a helper text kind of field, as from it we can add text to help the merchant or whoever is editing this metafield to better understand what the purpose of it is and what kind of data we are expecting in there, in case it is not obvious enough just by its name. For now, I'm just going to add this is some helper text, so we can see later in the video how this looks like. Next, we have the Metafield type. By scrolling in this list, we will see every single type that is available, and right at the top we have the most used ones. I'm going to select single line text, and by selecting it, we got access to this one value or list of values thing, because this kind of metafield supports either storing a single value or more than one value in a list, which we can then loop through from the code. For now, I'm just going to keep this as one value. And then we also get access to this validations part of the form, which changes depending on the type of metafield we are creating. For example, for an integer type of metafield, the validations are different, and some type of metafields don't even have validations. For example, product doesn't have validations. Let's go back to single line text, and now let's fill this. First, we have limit to a preset of choices. When selecting this, we are able to type a few options, and the merchant will only be able to set the value of this metafield to be one of the values of these options. If you wanted to create some sort of select or drop-down experience, this is how you will do it. As you can see here that there is no drop-down field or type of metafield, and there is also no select type of metafield. So this is how you will create that experience. I'm going to unselect this, and now we have minimum character count. The name is self-descriptive, likewise for maximum character count. And then we have regular expression. This is used if you want to enforce a pattern in the value of this metafield. For example, let's say that we are creating a metafield for storing phone numbers. For example, if you were creating a product and some products will have a support line attached to them, you will create a metafield for storing that information. And if you wanted to enforce that the value of this metafield will always be a valid phone number, this is where you will put a regular expression for this. By clicking on this, you get a few common use regular expressions. For example, if you wanted to set one for an email address, this is how that will look like. Next, we have these options over here. By default, a storefront is checked, and if we click here on learn more, this is basically so our metafield is visible to different parts of Shopify, such as through Liquid, through the theme editor, for dynamic sources, custom storefronts, and Hydrogen. It is selected by default because usually when you are creating a metafield, you want it to be visible. And also keep in mind that if for some reason you cannot access a metafield, you can double check in the settings that this checkbox is selected. Next, we have these two options. Use as filter in the admin is when you want to be able to find the products that have a specific value for this metafield from the Shopify admin. So to better show you what this looks like, here from the products page over here in the admin, if you click over here on search and then add filter, you will see here under metafields all of the metafields that can be used for filtering. I enable filtering for this metafield in particular just to show it to you as an example, but you should have here a list of every metafield you have enabled that option for, or none at all if you haven't enabled it for anything yet. And we have using automated collections. What this means is that when you're creating an automated collection, which is a collection that adds products automatically to it based on some criteria, by selecting this option, you will be able to select the value of this metafield as a criteria for it. For example, you can create a collection that automatically adds every product with the value 1 in this metafield to it. For now, I'm just going to leave these two turned off, and I'm going to click on save over here. By the way, if you want to check this list over here for every single Metafield type that is available, I'll leave this in the video description. It has over here a description of what this type of Metafield is, an example of it, and whether it supports this or not. After creating the Metafield, we should see the Metafield here at the top, and at a glance we see the Metafield name, then namespace and key, the content type, and in how many products it is being used. If we click on it, we can change a few things of it, such as the validations, the name and description, but when it comes to the namespace and key and the product and the Metafield type, we cannot change those. So make sure you select the appropriate values at the time of creating it, because if you needed to modify this in the future, you will need to delete the Metafield altogether and create it again. At first, that's fine because, so you see here, it is only used in 0 products, but let's say that there were 100 products where this Metafield was defined. If you were to delete it and create it again, then those 100 values will be lost. Therefore, try to create it correctly at first to avoid that issue. You may also notice that here we have pinned 6 out of 20. What this means is that we can only pin 20 metafields to each resource type, so 20 metafields for product, 20 for collection, 20 for customer, and so on. But we can create much more than 20. So if I just unpin this, it will appear over here, and it says pin 5 out of 20, but I have 6 metafields. This 5 plus this one that is unpinned. The limit of metafields that we can create per resource type at the time of recording is 200. So 200 metafields for products, 200 for collections, 200 for customers, and so on. If this were to change in the future, it will appear over here in the Shopify changelog. Now let's fill the metafield. I'll close this and go to products. And from here, I'm going to select this one, for example. And if I scroll to the bottom, here I see all of the metafields that have been created for the product resource. By clicking on this, I have the helper text over here, and I can fill this with any text value because this is a single line text metafield. So let's say example value. I can click on save here, and the metafield has been filled for this particular product. Also, if I want to go to the definition because I forgot what the namespace and key for this metafield were, I can click on that button over there, and I'll get to the settings for that metafield. Now, note that if I go to any other product, like for example this one, that metafield will be empty for it because metafields are individual to each resource, in this case to each product. Now, you might have noticed that we did not have the option of setting an initial value for the metafield we just created. What that means is that if I go to any of these products, by default, the value of this metafield will just be empty. There is, however, a workaround for this. So if I click on this checkbox over here, this will select all of the products, and then I can click on bulk edit here to go to the bulk editor. From here, I can click on columns and scroll until I find the metafield that I want to set an initial value for. Then if I select the first item here and press shift and select the last item here, this will select all of the products here. This is also showing variants. This is why not every single row is selected, because this one, for example, this row is a variant, but this is a product metafield. So for all of the variants, this example metafield just doesn't apply. Anyways, here we also selected the example value that we set a moment ago. To unselect it, I'm going to press Command and click it, or Control if you're on Windows, and then I'm going to press ESC or Escape. That has unselected only that row. Now I'm going to set initial value and click on Save. And you can see here that all of them have an initial value of initial value here, except for this one, which has example value because we just filled that a moment ago. Now if I go to any of these products, their value should be updated. Now let me show you how to access the value of the metafield from within our Shopify theme. So I'm going to click here on Go to Definition, and I'm going to copy this custom.example metafield, which is the namespace and key combination. And then from the code base here, I'm going to go to the product section, which in this case for Dawn, which is the theme I'm using, is main product.liquid. And from here, let's say example metafield right at the top, and I'm going to say product.metafields, and I'm going to paste custom.example metafield. So here will go the namespace and here the key. I'm going to save this, and then in my theme running locally, which I run through Shopify CLI, here localhost 9292, I'm going to go to a product page such as this one, and here at the top I see example metafield and example value being the value that I have here. If I were to clear this and have this metafield empty, I can refresh the page here, It might take a moment for this value to be updated internally for Shopify. Okay, so after about 30 seconds, we got the updated value here, which is empty, as expected. I'm going to keep this part in the video just so you know that even after you update the value in the admin, it will take some time to get updated in the front end. Anyways, now that we have that here, and we have no value for the Metafield, displaying this example Metafield at the top doesn't make that much sense because there isn't a value to show here, so this is empty. What we can do from the code is wrap all of this in a conditional. So if, and I'm going to paste all of this over here in the conditional, if product.metafields.custom.example metafield, so if it is defined, then render all of this. So if it isn't, we won't render anything. But for the other products which have this metafield defined, because we did so a moment ago, I can go here and I'll see example metafield and initial value here. So this is how we make our UI more resilient to metafields, as you cannot make a metafield required. So you should account for the fact that in some instances it may be undefined. Now we'll cover the Metafield types. Most of them work roughly the same as the single line text field we saw a moment ago, so I'll focus on the ones that might do something beyond that. Let's start here. So single line text, we already know how that works. Multi-line text, this works exactly the same as single line text, but it is a multi-line one. Integer and decimal, they are numbers, so you are limited to just inputting numbers here, but at the time of accessing the value stored in them, it is exactly the same as single line text as well. Product, there is a more unique one, so let's say related product. I'll copy this key over here and I'll save the Metafield just like that. Then I'll come over here and refresh this. In related product here, now I can select another product and have it as a value of this Metafield. So let me select this one. Let's save. And let's see how to get this value in the code. Okay, so from the code here, I'm going to say product Metafield. And here, let's say product.metafields.custom.related product. If I save this, I get here the product ID, but this is not exactly what I want. Usually I will want to do something like product.title. But if I save this like this, it doesn't work. I don't get anything here. To get the actual product object, you need to use value. So after the name of your key, you use .value, and then you can access any property of the product object. So here, you see that I get the product title. I can get also the price, use the money filter to format it. So yes, that's how you access the product object from within a Metafield. Continuing with the different type of Metafields, let's go to the next one, which is file over here. Let's create product guide, for example. Here, let's say that we will accept all type of files. Note this over here, that images and videos are optimized for storefront display, but all other type of files are intended for downloading. So I'm going to click on save over here, and then I'm going to go to my product. I'm going to refresh, and here I have product guide. Now I can select the file over here. I'm going to select this Shopify PDF and save this. Now let's see how we can access it. Now from the code, let's see how we can access the value of that Metafield. So file Metafield. I'm going to copy this part over here because it is the same. And here I'll just put the key, which is product guide. If I save this, let's see what we get. I get a generic file ID, which is not exactly what I want. As they mentioned a moment ago, any type of file other than video or images are intended for downloading, so I would like to get a link for this instead. What we have to do is use value again. Once we use value, we'll get a generic file drop. If from here I use the JSON filter to inspect this, I'll see all of the properties that I have available here, and the one that I want is URL, because this is the download URL. So let me get just that. Here, I'll remove this JSON over here. I'm going to say URL. And here we have the URL for this file. So what we can do instead now is copy all of this. Let's say href. I'll paste all of this over here. Let's say download now. If I go to the page here, I see here download now. As I'm in Chrome, the PDF gets opened in here, but I have this download button right at the top. The UI you'll see here will depend on the browser that you're using, but this is Shopify PDF, which is the file that we used a moment ago, and you can see here that it is hosted in Shopify CDN. So this Metafield is working fine. Next, let's do the same but for an image file. So let's set a definition once again. Let's say just image Metafield. The type will be file again, but this time around I'm going to limit this to specific file types, and I'm going to just select images here. These are all the formats that are supported, and I'm making this example because if you were to look for image here, there is no image type, so you might, if you didn't know that with file you are supposed to also upload images, you might think that Metafields don't support images. Anyways, now here, let's refresh this. And let's select an image. For example, I will select this one over here. I'll save. Now let's go to the store here. And from the code, let's say image file Metafield. I'll copy all of this again. And let's say, actually let's use the image filter instead. So I'll say product.metafield.image Metafield. Let's say image URL, let's give it a width of 500, and let's use image tag now. Define filter image. It didn't detect that we are using image tag, but I think it should work fine. Here we are seeing the image. Yes, the issue just got fixed over here, and we are seeing the image being displayed as we expect it to be displayed. Note that I didn't have to use .value for the image to be displayed over here. The image is here, and I just used the key here, unlike in the last two examples where I had to use .value to get access to the URL or to the product object itself. However, you can use value each time you're accessing a Metafield to not have to keep track of which ones requires you to use value and which ones don't. So if I save this, everything should look the same. And let's give example Metafield a value here, so some value. Just to show you that for single line text Metafields, you can also use .value and it will also display just fine. So if I refresh this, we get some value here. If I remove value, .value here, I still get the same, but I can keep .value to have consistency whenever I'm accessing a Metafield. Let's continue with the date Metafield. Date and dating time both work roughly the same. So here I'm going to say date Metafield. I'm going to save this. And from this product over here, let's set a date, for example, this one. Save. And now let's access this for the store. So here in the code, let's say date Metafield And let me copy all of this. Date Metafield value. And if I save this and refresh here, I get the date in this format. However, normally you wouldn't want to display it just like this. And fortunately here we can use the date filter to format this in a different way. So from the documentation here, I'm just going to copy this format right here to use this one. So I'll save this. And we get this nicely formatted date. If you want to use a different format, check the documentation for formatting using this filter. It redirects to the Ruby documentation because Liquid is built with Ruby, so that is why it goes there. It uses the same formatting syntax. Let's continue with the next type. Here we have measurements. We can use dimensions, volume, or weight. I'm going to pick weight here, but all of these work roughly the same. These are just a number with a unit attached to them. So the reason why you will want to use this instead of something like an integer or a decimal is because the unit matters to you. So in this case, we have access to all of these units for measuring the weight. And here I'm going to name this weight Metafield. I'm going to save this. And now from the product here, I'm going to refresh. And I have this weight Metafield over here. I'm going to fill this with 20, for example. I'm going to select this unit and I'm going to save. Now let's print the value. So from here, I'm going to do product.metafields as custom, copying all of this, and then weight Metafield, and here at the top, weight Metafield, and I'm going to put that value here. By saving this here, I get what I filled this with a moment ago. I can also access the unit by using that unit here in case I needed this. Let's continue with Richtext over here. So let's name this Richtext Metafield. I'm going to save this. From here, I'm going to refresh. And I'm going to start writing something here. This is a rich text. I'm going to put this in bold. Some more text. And then let's create a list here. First, second, third. And let's also add a heading here. Or let's add an H5. This is a heading 5. And lastly, let's add a paragraph here. This is the last paragraph. And this will be a link. So let's link to shopify.com. Let's insert all of this and let's save this. Now let's see how we can render this value. To render this, here in the code, let's say Richtext Metafield, and from here I'm going to say product.metafields.custom.richtext Metafield.value. If I save this, I get this, which is not exactly what I want. Even though my content is here, it is somewhere nested within this object. To get the HTML of the rich text that we created, we will have to use the Metafield tag filter, and we will have to remove this value. This is the one instance where we cannot use that value because Metafield tag doesn't support that. And here we have our content rendered just as we created it when we were adding the value of the Metafield. we even have the link here which redirects to shopify.com, as you can see in the bottom left. Let's continue here. So next we have reference types such as product, collection, product variant, and so on. The idea for all of this is roughly the same as for product. You will use .value to get access to the object, and then you can access any of the object's properties. So for example, for collection, you will use .value to access the collection object, and from there you can access .title to access the collection's title, .products to access the collection's products, and so on. We have meta object here. I'll leave this one for a future video because meta objects have a lot of depth to them. This also will cover mixed reference, as mixed reference is related to meta object. Anyways, continuing, we have these ones in group in order. They are self-descriptive. True or false will be a boolean, color will store a color, rating will store a rating, URL will store a link or URL, and money will work very similar to measurements over here. So they will store a number with a unit. The unit in this case will be the currency. Then we have JSON, which is used for storing complex data that was not covered in any of these metafields. Both JSON and meta object over here can be used for storing complex data, but the cases where you will want to use one or the other will differ. By default, even though we haven't covered it yet, meta objects are the better option out of the two, as they are more user-friendly to work with because the person filling them doesn't have to be familiar with the JSON syntax. Also, they work by reference, so if more than one product will have the same value in this field, they can both reference the same meta object. In the case of JSON, you'd have to individually fill the same JSON for each one, even if the JSON is the same. JSON, however, is more universally accessible in Shopify, so that is why the JSON type still exists. For example, in contexts like Shopify functions, you can't query a meta object at the time of recording, but you can query a metafield of type JSON. So if you are creating a metafield that needs to support that, then JSON will be the way to go. JSON here, let us set a schema here for validation, because otherwise the person filling this might accidentally mistype a metafield JSON key or something like that. So here I have this JSON schema builder, which I'll link in the video description. Let's create a simple schema here. So I'm going to remove all of this. And let's say that I wanted to store a message, which will be a string and is required, and then message opacity, because we will display the message with the given opacity obtained from this JSON value. So I'm going to also make this required. And then here, I'm going to copy all of this, which is the JSON schema. I'm going to paste this here. We got to copy the first curly bracket here at the top. And now let's name this JSON Metafield. And let's save this. And now let's go over here. And let's fill this. So I can start typing a JSON. And if I try to save this, it fails because it doesn't pass the validation we just created. So we have to say message Metafield JSON Metafield message. And then for opacity here, let's give it 0.5. Let's save this. And the name of the key we used was message opacity. So this is why the schema is important, to ensure that always the same key is used. If I try to save this now, this worked just fine. Now let's see how we can access this. From the code here, I'm going to say JSON Metafield, and then I'm going to do product.metafields.custom JSON Metafield .value. And if I save this, I get here my JSON. So now let's say that I want to get message. This renders the message, and let's make the opacity the value of message opacity from here. So style opacity will be message opacity. If I save this, we can see here that the opacity is 0.5 as indicated by the value of the metafield. Next, let's create a list metafield. As the name suggests, this is for storing a list of values. Earlier in the video I showed a table with the Metafield types that support lists. In this case I'm going to use single line text, and here I'm going to select list of values. I'm going to save this, and now going to the product here, I'm going to refresh. And I'll do here value 1, value 2, value 3. I'm going to save this. And now let's render these values. So here I'll do this metafield, and I'll do a for loop. So for item in product.metafields.custom.list metafield.value. Then I'm going to render item.value. Let's save this. Seems like we have an error here somewhere. Seems like value isn't needed in this case. There we go. As we are using .value here at the top, we don't have to use it again when accessing the item variable. Something else we can do with metafields is access them through the theme editor. So here I'll go to the product template over here, the default product template, and I'm going to add a text block over here. This works because this text block is in my theme already, but what I'm trying to show you is independent from that. Here I have this connect dynamic source. Whenever you see this button in the theme editor, you can connect this to a dynamic source such as a metafield. So for example, I'm going to connect this to example metafield, and as you can recall from earlier in the video, I filled example metafield with initial value for every product. So I get text block initial value, but I can put here anything else, like for example, this is the value for example metafield. So let's save this, and in this case it says this is the value for example metafield initial value. But if I go here and refresh, I shall see this is the value for example metafield some value, because example metafield in this case has some value as its value. So this is very useful if you wanted to give the merchant the option of setting some parts of the product template or of any template to be dynamic. Now I'll cover standard metafield definitions. When creating a metafield and filling this name property here, we get a list of suggestions. These are what are known as standard metafield definitions. Let's go to the documentation to better understand what they are about. So from here, these are basically metafield definitions that Shopify has created for common use cases. If you need to store data that falls under these cases, you should use a standard metafield, as they are interoperable between apps and themes. In practice, what this means is that, for example, let's say we want to store a product subtitle. By using a standard metafield definition, if you install a third-party app that also needs to access that information, in case it is defined in your store, then that app will know where to find it, because it will be stored under a predictable namespace and key combination. In contrast, if you were to store this same information using a namespace and key combination of your own, that third-party app wouldn't know where to find it, so it may assume it doesn't exist. Another good example is the rating standard metafield definition. By using this one, when you install a third-party app for reviews in the future, if you were to do so, it could use the data stored in this metafield as a starting point. Also, third-party apps that use this standard metafield definition are interoperable in between them. So if you install reviews app A and then want to switch to reviews app B, if they are both using the same standard metafield definition, porting the data between one and the other would be way easier than if they were not using it. I'll leave this link in the video description, and I encourage you to go through this table and check all the standard metafields that are available. so you get an idea of what is there for you to use. As if you are creating a metafield that falls under any of these cases, it will be advisable to use this instead. Let's quickly select here product subtitle just so you see how selecting a standard metafield definition looks like. We get automatically the name, the type of the field, and the namespace and key combination right away. So even though we can change it over here, well, if we click on change, it loses its status as a standard metafield definition. So you have to leave it as is, or click on change and create a metafield of your own. Now let's see how to access metafields dynamically. For this, I went ahead and created this section that has only a single setting for a metafield key, and I went ahead and rendered this dynamic metafield h2 just so we know that the page has this section over here. I added it from the theme editor here at the top. Now let's create a variable here to store a key, and let's say example metafield, as we have a metafield with this key. And let's do product.metafields.custom, and we are going to use this syntax instead, where we pass a variable that has the key. This is useful when you don't know the key ahead of time. For example, if it is coming from a setting. Right now I have it here hard-coded, but later we'll see how to get it from the setting instead. Anyways, here you can see that some value is being rendered the same value that this metafield has, as shown here. I can change it to any other metafield that is valid, like for example date metafield, which we also defined earlier in the video. If I save this, I get the date metafield value. Now let's get it from the settings instead. So let's do section.settings.metafield key. If I save this, at first we don't have anything here, but if I now here type example metafield and save this, and then I refresh this page, I get some value again. We can also get the type and do something based on it, so let's take this, let's paste it here. So if the type is equal to Richtext Metafield, then let's render this, but using the Metafield tag filter. Else, let's render this without the Metafield tag. And this at the top doesn't need to be enclosed in p tags here. Let's save this. For now, we don't see any change, but if I change the key to be Richtext Metafield, let's refresh the page here, and probably the type is something else. You can always print this value. So it is not metafield, it is field. Let's save this, and now we are getting our rich text rendered as expected. But if we change this to example metafield, we are also getting it rendered as it should be. And that's it for this video. Stay tuned for the next one, where we'll be covering meta objects. And remember, if you found this video to be helpful, like and subscribe for more Shopify related content.